Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third panel of International Conference on Digital Diplomacy. This panel will discuss the theme about making sense of data and digital diplomacy. Our speakers today will focus on how the role of data is critical in raising awareness of and ensuring that the voices of the vulnerable and invisible populations are not silenced. Information plays an important role in our daily life. A large, diverse set of information that grow at ever-increasing rates is defined as big data. Big data is collected from various outlets, including social media. It turns out that big data, if managed effectively, will be able to support digital diplomacy. My name is Cornelia Amy, and I am very honored to be here, even though we cannot see each other in person, but I really hope, since I know that, correct me if I'm wrong, that in panel number 3, it's going to have more than 1,000 participants. So I hope that there will be a dynamic Q&A session, a fruitful discussion, and comprehensive discussion. So, dearest participants, if you chose panel number 3, then you are ready to hear more and you are ready to understand more about the importance of data, especially how to implement the data to enhance and to improve the quality of digital diplomacy. How to do those things? That will be answered by our 4 esteemed speakers. We have 4 speakers joining me right now, each with their respective expertise on big data. Let me introduce our speakers today. First, we have Bapak Josua Sitompul, SHMM, as Coordinator of Law and Cooperation, Director General of Informatics Applications, Ministry of Communication and Informatics, from Indonesia. Selamat siang, good afternoon, Pak Josua.
Selamat siang, good afternoon.
Selamat siang. Salam sehat, Pak Josua. And next we have Mr. Ben Bland, the Director of Southeast Asia Program at the Lowy Institute. Good afternoon, Mr. Bland.
Selamat sore dari sini.
Okay, Mr. Bland is currently pursuing data-driven research projects on internet governance and international aid flows in Southeast Asia. He regularly provides commentary and analysis to a wide range of international media organizations, including BBC, Bloomberg, CNN, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, The New York Times, Reuters, and The Washington Post. And next speaker, we have Professor Jovan Kurbalija. Good afternoon, Professor Jovan.
Good afternoon. Hi. Hello.
Hello. Mr. Jovan is the Executive Director of DiploFoundation as well as Head of Geneva Internet Platform. Professor Kurbalija is a former diplomat, and he has a professional and academic background in international law, diplomacy, and information technology. He has been a pioneer in the field of cyber diplomacy since 1992, when he established the Unit of Information Technology and Diplomacy at the Mediterranean Academy of Diplomatic Studies in Malta and later on DiploFoundation. And last but not least, we have Ms. Alexandria Walden as the Head of Human Rights Affairs, Government Affairs, and Public Policy of Google. Good afternoon, Ms. Walden. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's nice to see you here, even though we cannot see each other in person, but I really hope to hear such a fruitful discussion from you, to hear such a good ideas and nice general thoughts from each of you. So without further ado, I will again remind to all participants during our discussion, if you have any questions pop up in your mind, you can write it down on our chat box. And after that, we can compile it and we will direct it to the speakers that you wish to hear the answer from. So if you wish to write down your question, you can please write down your name and then you can write down your institution and then your question, and please direct the question to at least one of the panelists. So I would like to begin today's panel session. I will go to Mr. Josua as the very first speaker, from Coordinator of Law and Cooperation, Director General of Informatics Application, Ministry of Communications and Informatics. Selamat siang, Pak Josua. Apa kabar, Pak? Sehat, Pak?
Selamat siang, salam sehat.
Iya, Pak Josua, ini kan kita berbicara mengenai pentingnya data, bagaimana mengimplementasikan supaya bisa meningkatkan diplomasi digital. Nanti kira-kira yang akan disampaikan dong, Pak, poin-poin pentingnya sedikit bocoran. Kira-kira apa, Pak Josua?
Kalau berdasarkan dari SOR, memang yang kami akan sampaikan pertama adalah beberapa figur dari digital data di Indonesia, lalu bagaimana data tersebut terkait dengan vulnerable dan invisible population, kemudian kaitannya juga dengan management of data untuk mendukung digital diplomacy. Itu.
Baik, kalau begitu nanti waktu pemaparannya sekitar 7 menit, Pak Josua. Jadi waktu dan tempat kami persilahkan untuk Pak Josua untuk memberikan pemaparannya. Silakan, Pak.
Okay. Very good afternoon for all of you. Probably it's in the morning in other parts of the world. First of all, sincere apologies from Mr. Samuel Pangarapan for not being able to attend in this important and very interesting event. So the second slide, please. If we could see the second. Next. Okay. So these are some figures of digital data in Indonesia. We can see there are some indications. First of all, internet users in Indonesia indicate significant implications, such as the power in the financial or business, the economy, and also it reflects how Indonesian users could use internet and also social media to communicate and to express their rights, particularly freedom of expression and freedom of belief in the exchange of ideas through social media or other media through the internet. So, for example, regarding the financial implications, 78% of internet users shop online each month, and 39.2% of banking applications users also have been used to shop online. $70 billion is estimated the value of Indonesian digital economy in 2021, and it expected to reach $146 billion in 2025, and about 266.3 trillion, the value of Indonesian e-commerce transaction in 2020, and is projected to reach 395 trillion rupiah in 2001. And if you see the use of internet, almost 9 hours a day, Indonesian internet users spend in accessing internet, and Facebook and Instagram are some of the favorite social media platforms for Indonesians. And it gives also implication that Indonesian users are very dependent on social media and also the internet in their doing their daily activities. Next. Now we are discussing about making sense of data and digital diplomacy. The first issue that we would like to share is raising awareness of and ensuring that the voices of vulnerable and invisible populations are not silenced. If we see the data mentioned above, it does not reflect all parts of Indonesian region, because as we see that there are some regions in Indonesia are considered as the frontier, outermost, and remote regions. They are regions that are not yet have the access as luxury as we have in big cities or some parts of Indonesia. So the data from vulnerable and invisible groups also reflect their voices and interests. And there is no Indonesia without those parts of regions, and that's why in our strategic plan, those areas, the frontier, outermost, and remote regions, are regions that we focus to provide more broadband access through palaparing or satellite and fiber optics. Through this strategy, it is expected that all parts of the Indonesia, particularly those areas, would also enjoy the internet and also the benefits of having social media and other devices that they could use. Other than that, Indonesia also implements cloud-first policy for ministries and government institutions. This is also useful for regional governments that have lack of, for example, data center infrastructure or other financial impediments. Through these policies, they could also give, for example, services for their stakeholders and also users in their area through the cloud or cloud services. So that's how we try to raising awareness and ensuring that people from remote areas also could access internet and also enjoy public services in their area. Next slide, please. Now, regarding the management of data to support digital diplomacy. Digital diplomacy is very interesting idea or concept. And if we try to implement in the lately policies that Indonesia would like to develop, digital diplomacy would be establishing safe, clean, productive, and democratic cyberspace. And how we could pursue that diplomacy, first of all, under Indonesian law, there's a registration of electronic system providers policy. It means that every electronic system provider that fall under particular criteria must register. So if we imagine that in the banking sector, there's a know your customer policy. So in this concept, we try to implement know your electronic system provider. If we would like to build a health and also responsible cyberspace, Indonesian users should also be able to understand to whom they are transact with. And in order for that, we apply the registration electronic system provider. The second one is that there's a huge difference between regulation in 2012 and 2019. In 2012, we tried to implement data localization in the strict sense. Electronic system providers that provide public services must have their data center in Indonesia. But since 2019, we give flexibility for electronic system providers to process or store their data outside Indonesia. But one thing that we require is that electronic system providers must be able to ensure the effectiveness of supervision or law enforcement in Indonesian territory. And a particular criteria for that is that the electronic system providers should be able to provide access to data for the purpose of supervision and also law enforcement. The third policy that we try to implement in order to establish this digital diplomacy is the use of government data center for ministries and government institutions. It means that we would like to build a coherent and also productive in the management of data for public services. So the Ministry of ICT has established a national data center for ministries and also government institutions in where they could store and process their data. But these policies to use the national data center is not applied for private electronic system providers because they have the flexibilities as mentioned before. I think that's some of the policies that we try to implement in order to build this digital diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Josua, for such a good explanation. If I can conclude a little bit from your presentation, there are some infrastructure to support gaining the data from all range of society in Indonesia. We've seen, as you mentioned earlier, palaparing, fiber optics, etc., as well as you mentioned that establishing safe and democratic cyberspace is one thing to support digital diplomacy. Maybe later on Q&A session, I have another question coming for you, but I will ask it later on. But one thing to be highlighted from your presentation is also the ease of access, flexibility to store and process data outside Indonesia is also important to be highlighted as well, especially for our government, because sometimes the issue of the ease of access and flexibility to store the data outside from Indonesia is really sometimes making our society a bit insecure. So maybe I will ask a question about it later on. Thank you very much, Pak Josua, for joining with us from Government of Indonesia, Ministry of Communication and Informatics. We will move to our second speakers, but before we jump to our second speakers, I will give a very warm welcome. I will call, wait a minute. I will call Mr. Ben Bland to join us as our second speaker. Mr. Bland, hello.
Hi, thanks, Cornelia.
Yeah, Mr. Bland, before we jump to the general thoughts and your ideas, could you please tell us a little bit about your presentation, maybe a sneak peek about your ideas and thoughts?
Okay, thanks. And thanks to Kemlu for inviting me today. It's a great initiative, great to be with you. So I'm going to be talking about how we can use data to communicate, to explain, and to persuade in the international arena. And I guess one key thing I want people to take away is that using data in digital diplomacy isn't just for national governments. We heard a lot earlier from ministers and senior diplomats, but I want to focus on how other people can use data in digital diplomacy to persuade, to convince people of their argument. And that could be think tanks where I work, the media, civil society, even local governments, city governments. And it's really, I want to talk about how this data can be a key tool to level the information playing field. And when it comes to persuading people to do the things that we want, which is really what digital diplomacy is all about, I think, at the end of the day.
Right, that's a great idea. I'm looking forward to hearing it more. So you have around 7 minutes. Your time budget is around 7 minutes. So I will give the floor to you, Mr. Ben, for becoming our second speaker.
Thanks. And if your colleagues could just start the slideshow, that would be appreciated. Great. And if you can go to the first slide, the next one. Thanks. So just start with a bit of fun. These are the world's top leaders in terms of followers on the key social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We can see Jokowi does really well on Twitter and Instagram. He's behind some others on Facebook, which is interesting. But one point here to make is that quantity is not the same as quality. And if we want to know why, just ask Donald Trump. Because he would be at the top, I think, of all these lists if he hadn't been removed from these platforms earlier this year, technically suspended for inciting violence. So it's just a reminder that it's not just, getting a lot of followers, but it's what you say and the quality of your engagements. Next slide, please. So it's often said that data is like oil. It's an expression we hear all the time, and that implies that data is something that's really valuable. Like oil, you can make a lot of money from it. And I think that's partly true, that data is valuable, but people forget the other part of oil, that it's really hard to find oil. It's really difficult and expensive to extract it, right? And then once you've extracted it, you have to refine the oil to make it into a useful product. And then you have to get that product to the consumers, to the market. So it is like oil, but not in the way you think. And actually getting useful insights from a lot of data is really hard. You can spend a lot of time on it, and you don't always know if you're going to succeed. Next slide. So a lot of us have been in lockdown for much of the last 2 years, and we spent a lot of time with Lego, either our own Lego or our kids' Lego, passing time while we haven't been able to go out. And I think this is just a really good depiction of data and how, you know, it is a building block, but it's really what you do with it. You have all these jumbled up pieces in the first instance, then you have to sort it into colors, you arrange it, then you might visualize it. But the last part, I think, for me as a former journalist, which is what I used to do before I became a researcher, is really important, is to explain your data with a story. So pretty charts or pretty numbers aren't very useful unless you have a narrative, a story that people can easily understand, because humans don't really understand data alone as well as we understand stories. So if you can match good data that you've extracted and refined with a good story, then you can really communicate your message very, very well indeed. And now I'm going to show you 3 examples, I think, of great data visualizations. And none of them are from national governments. And that's deliberate, because I want to show that it's not just national governments who can engage in digital diplomacy, but it's really all of us. Next slide, please. So the first one is actually some research that my colleagues at the Lowy Institute produced, looking at aid from China to Pacific Island nations. We heard from some of their government representatives earlier. And we decided to do this research because there was a lot of talk 3 or 4 years ago about debt trap diplomacy in the Pacific, that China was lending so much money to the Pacific Island nations, it was burdening them with debt, and it was going to cause a big debt crisis and leave these countries very vulnerable politically. And my colleagues who work on the Pacific Islands wanted to find out if that was true. They wanted to help these governments better understand the flows of foreign aid to the region. So they embarked on a very detailed project to try and understand who was giving money to the Pacific Islands and what the terms of that was. So they ended up analyzing tens of thousands of aid projects in the Pacific, 40 million unique data points, which is fiendishly complex data set. And in the end, they managed to discover that while China was making a lot of commitments of aid to the Pacific, it wasn't necessarily delivering. And that's a negative thing in one sense. But the flip side was this debt problem that people had feared, it wasn't there, because China wasn't giving as much loans as people had feared. And so things were actually much more manageable. And that was just one part of the bigger story my colleagues were able to collect in the Pacific Aid Map, which was this project they embarked on. And I think just one example of how you can dig very deep and find useful insights that help countries to be more resilient, to understand the world around them. Next slide, please. So this second chart is actually from a media organization, from the Financial Times, and it's really about global vaccine inequality. So the chart on the left-hand side shows that rich countries like Australia, where I live at the moment, have given out more COVID vaccine boosters in the last 3 months than the world's poorest countries have given total doses in the whole year. So basically, while rich countries are giving further booster shots to people who are already vaccinated, the world's poorest countries are still struggling to give even the first shots to many hundreds of million, if not several billion people. And I think in this one chart on the left, they made this point very, very simply. It highlights starkly how unfair global vaccine distribution has been and how many rich countries have failed to live up to their rhetoric to provide the poorer countries with the vaccine supply they need. And I think one simple chart like this, well presented, can be more impactful than 100 speeches to the UN General Assembly by developing country leaders. And this comes from a media organization. It's not from a government. So a really good example of the sorts of things media organizations can do. But obviously, anyone can do this sort of analysis if they do the hard work to extract the oil, to refine it and to present it in the right way. And last example, the next slide, please. This last one is about premature deaths from pollution related to coal-fired power, which is a really important issue we will have all seen at the COP26 negotiations in Glasgow over the last couple of weeks. And this chart actually comes from an organization called C40, which is composed of some of the world's most important city mayors, including the mayor of Sydney, where I live, the mayor of Jakarta, where I used to live, and many other mayors from around Asia and the rest of the world. And this chart is trying to highlight really how people in cities like Jakarta, Kolkata, Beijing, Shanghai, they're really exposed to the air pollution from coal-fired power. And as things stand, leading up to 2030, because of the massive expansion of coal-fired power, we're going to see that's going to lead to a dramatic increase, unfortunately, in early deaths related to pollution from coal-fired power stations. And I think this is fascinating because this data was pulled together by cities. And we've seen that national governments haven't necessarily done a great job of pushing the boundaries of climate negotiations. But here we have city mayors coming together using data and charts to try and make a really important point about the need to have more action. And I think cities can play a really big role working together when national governments fall short. And last slide, please. So just a few tips before I wrap up here about how we can do digital diplomacy better. And that this goes for everyone. For myself, I often think about how I can do these sorts of things better for national governments, for NGOs, for the media. So the first thing is, as I said at the start, that in the digital world, diplomacy is not limited to national governments, to foreign ministries and diplomats. It's something we can all do. The second thing is relevant to everyone, is that transparency is the key to credibility. So if you want people to trust your data, you have to show your methodology. You have to show your workings. You can't just have a pretty chart and not expect people to come and have a look at what you've done. And if you want people to believe you, you need to show where you've got the data from. You need to explain how you manipulated it, why you're showing the things that you're showing. And you need to talk about the problems with the data sets you're looking at. The next point relates to that don't enter the fray of this sort of digital diplomacy unless you're prepared to be challenged. Because once you've gone on social media or you've made a presentation of your fancy charts, researchers, other governments, they are going to criticize what you do. They're going to look through your numbers. They're going to look through your work and see if you're telling the full picture or if you're manipulating things. So you have to be prepared for that contest in this much more level playing field. The next point was the one I showed with the Lego earlier. You have to use data to tell a story, not just a pretty chart for the sake of it, but what's the point you want to get across? What's your story? And it's important that you tell your story, the last point before I wrap up, because unless you as a country, as a city, an organization, an NGO, unless you can define your narrative, the story you want to tell, others are going to define it for you and not in the ways you want. And I just think data and good charts with a story is just a great way to get your message across, to influence, to persuade, and to convince people in this very contested information space we all live in. So thanks a lot, and looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. Terima kasih.
Sama-sama, terima kasih. Thank you very much, Mr. Ben Glenn, for such a good explanation about how to visualize data. If I can conclude, you've mentioned that quantity is different with quality. So good data, especially visualized data, is way, way, way much better than 100 speeches in UN General Assembly. I can put that as my quote. So it is very hard to extract data, as what you mentioned earlier, to write data. I'm curious about the tips and tricks. Maybe I can ask you during the Q&A session later on, how to do the right research if there are possibilities for us getting trapped to the overwhelming flow of data. And you also mentioned about how to visualize the data to become information, because a lot of data, big data, will be useless if we cannot narrow it down and visualize to share it to others. So thank you very much, Mr. Ben Glenn. I'm looking forward to ask more questions to you during the Q&A session. And now we are moving to our next speaker.
Well, if you can hear me, I lost you. Can somebody say something to just make sure that it's not on my side? I can't hear you anymore.
Yeah, Cornelia, I think you're on mute still.
You're on mute, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear my voice? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we have our next speaker, Professor Jovan. Professor Jovan, before we jump to your presentation, I would like to hear more about your key points, because previously we've heard about how to gather and how to visualize the big data. So it's time to us to hear more about the importance of digital diplomacy from you, maybe the challenges that we have to face and how to undermine them. So with that, I would like to hear a sneak peek from you about your presentation and about your ideas and general thoughts.
Sure.
Professor Jovan.
Cornelia, sure, that's great. I'm really honored to be today here for one specific reason. My organization co-organized the first event 3 years ago, and I'm so happy to see that Jakarta Digital Diplomacy Conference is growing really in both size and in the content. What I'm going to do now, I will build on Ben's presentation and bring some of those examples closer to diplomacy, and also explain how it relates to diplomacy itself.
I see. So how to implement the capability of managing and researching the data. Okay, Professor Jovan, I will give the time to you. You have your time budget around 7 minutes. So the time and the floor is yours, Professor Jovan.
Thank you, Cornelia. And let me start with something that diplomats and all involved in international relations can relate to. Ben told us about big data, and it has a lot of power. But sometimes we can use a small data to make insights. And let me start with the flags. Behind you, you can see the flags in front of the United Nations in Geneva. Those flags are flags of 193 states. Now, you can manually see what are the patterns, similarity between Indonesian and Polish flag. But what we did, we considered the flags and information on the flag as data. And what I want to illustrate is that you can find data and useful stories and useful insights in many places, sometimes in small data. And that's message for all small and developing countries, that you don't need to necessarily to have a big service. It helps, but you can get the insights from small data. Therefore, I was walking seeing these flags and said, okay, what are the patterns in these flags? Then we created, and you will be receiving links to the information system that does this. This is a small, let's say, AI application. We calculated what are the flag patterns on the flag, what are the colors, what are the symbols used, and then the system came to some sort of patterns of the flags. Typically, you have a Slavic flags with blue, white, and red. You have a Pan-Arab flags with their colors, green, red, white, black. You have the Commonwealth flags, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, and other patterns. Therefore, suddenly you ask yourself, why Slavic flags have this type of colors? And you realize that historically speaking, Peter the Great reformator of Russia, copied the Dutch flag. Basically, he thought, if these guys are so good in making ships, they're probably smart in choosing the colors for the flags. Now, this is almost trivial example, but you can find this type of examples in any type of diplomacy from the small data. And I'll give you a few illustrations. One illustration is to compare the GDP of the countries with annual revenue of tech companies. And then you realize that Vietnam is more or less equal to Apple. And you will be receiving the links from my side on trying to do it yourself, to compare your country, to compare Indonesia with tech companies. Again, small and simple data, but very valuable insights. And then what we did in Diplo research, we did also with the help of Wikimedia Foundation, we tried to see how many Wikipedia entries on Africa are edited by people from Africa. And we got to almost shocking example. And it relates, Cornelia, to the request or sort of guidelines for this session, how to ensure the data helps inclusion. And here is inclusion about knowledge. We got to the finding that only 5% of Wikipedia posts about Africa are written by people from Africa. It doesn't mean that all posts should be written by people from Africa, but we expected at least 50 to 60%. you can check the same thing for Indonesia, for other regions and countries. Therefore, inclusion and participation is not only connection of cables or internet. Inclusion matters also on the question of inclusion of knowledge, sharing national heritage, very rich Indonesian heritage from the earliest civilization, including some finding that number 0, which is in the basis of our era, was found in one of the Hindu temples in Indonesia or Cambodia. There are discussions on it. Now we have to hear from other experiences and to have full knowledge inclusion in these processes. And these are just a few examples, flags comparing countries, but on more sophisticated level, what is very interesting is a data sandbox application which we developed, and you will see a link to compare, for example, information about COVID. As you can see, here are the number of the COVID cases, number of the beds. What we notice is that absolute numbers, 1 million cases or 10,000 cases, they don't mean a lot if they're not put in the context. Therefore, we rank them and see how, for example, Indonesia was ranking in number of cases, number of beds, number of vaccines, and different parameters. And then you can get the bearings. Also, you have to correct it with the population, with the GDP, with other elements. Then you can see some patterns that can help you to get a deeper insight what it is all about, what are the causes for these developments. Therefore, from flags, via companies and countries, via Wikipedia, Africa input to Wikipedia, to more complex normalization of data on climate change, on health, to the last and concluding point on in my presentation is that whenever you deal with technology, you should remind yourself of so-called Gartner curve. Problem with us in technology, especially diplomatic services, is that we usually join technology when it comes to so-called disillusion slope, where companies are abandoning latest hype, whether it is big data, blockchain, AI. Now quantum computing is raising. And a lot of money is wasted till we go to the bottom. And then we realize how technology could be used on the plate of productivity. This is the crucial for diplomacy and diplomatic services to follow the hype and to basically clear what is a hype and what is something which is very practical and useful for them. There are many examples which I will share with you, including a speech generator for the UN, including analysis of the UN speeches, and it's almost endless. What you need is to avoid the hype, to see what is the purpose of data, and to develop a good story, to develop a good explanation. Over to you, Cornelia.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. If I can conclude, you mentioned earlier that inclusion and participation are not only related to the facilities such as cables and fiber optics, but also it linked with the cultural heritage. And you also mentioned about the importance of comparing data as well as the data pattern to understand deeper about current developing situations. So maybe later on during the Q&A session, I will mostly talk and I will mostly ask the question about that to you. So thank you very much, Professor, for joining with us to become our third speaker. And now, last but not least, we have our last speaker. So Ms. Olivia Walden, digital diplomacy is important with all the stuffs that have been explained earlier, but sometimes we get really insecure about our data. So how to tackle and how to solve this problem? Those questions will be answered by Ms. Walden from Google. Good afternoon. Hello.
Hi, thank you again for inviting me to join the distinguished panel today. I serve as the global head of human rights for Google, and throughout my work, I've spent time working across a variety of issues in the human rights field. And I bring all of those learnings to my work at Google. I've been at Google for just over 6 years, and I'm responsible for coordinating and driving our company-wide human rights strategy. So I work across all products in all regions. And like others at Google, I came here to contribute to the vision of building helpful products for everyone. And our work on business and human rights, what I work on, enables us to do that in a responsible way. Whether it's the pandemic or climate change or the health of the global economy, many of those problems of our era can be or must be addressed through deep collaboration across stakeholder groups and across borders. And so, you know, in this interconnected world, those kinds of collaborations depend on us bringing together international organizations, governments, private sector, and civil society. And we think technology is has an important role to play in helping us solve those problems. We've recently seen how technology-enabled solutions like smartphones and exposure notifications related to COVID-19 can help support public health authorities in the fight against COVID. Or other machine learning models can help reduce energy consumption. Or in another example, how AI can address cybersecurity and spam challenges. So we're proud to be investing in R&D every year to innovate for new technologies that can address these types of problems. What I wanted to do with my time today is maybe give a few examples of what some of this work looks like in practice. I think my co-panelists have walked through some very important context for thinking about how technology can be used across all of the, in a variety of ways to, as part of our work in digital diplomacy. And I wanted to maybe share a few examples specific to what Google's doing that are at the intersection of the work of governments and private sector in the digital space. The first is around our work on slowing the pandemic and supporting economic recovery. At the beginning of the pandemic, we wanted to help people find answers by surfacing critical information related to COVID-19. And so at the early stages of the pandemic, we partnered with the World Health Organization to run public service health announcements across Google Search and YouTube. And that partnership led to campaigns where we, across over 100 countries, had billions of ads with millions of clicks, where people were acquiring new information about this sort of, you have to think about where we were 2 years ago, where people were able to acquire new information about the state of what was happening in their communities and how they could protect themselves. Later, we turned our focus to helping millions of people around the world acquire skills to participate in a post-pandemic global economy, digital economy, post-pandemic when we get there, I guess we'll still say. And so we're continuing to do that kind of work. I wanted to share a specific example related to our work on the pandemic, though, something I worked closely on in the early days, and that's our work on something called the community mobility reports, because I think it's an interesting example of how we can think about preserving privacy and using data in ways to inform government and the general public about issues. So you may recall that in the early days of the pandemic, as the global community began to respond to COVID-19, there was increasing emphasis on social distancing and public health strategies to encourage slowing the rate of transmission. In Google Maps, we use aggregated data, anonymized data, to show the busyness of different types of places. And at the time, we, after consulting with a variety of stakeholders, including public health authorities, undertook an effort to create a product where we could use that data and publish these community mobility reports to provide insights on what had changed in response to how many people were in their homes, or were sheltering in place, or were in grocery stores or parks or other places in their community. Those reports were developed to help understand how people were observing social distancing guidance. Again, they were important because they used aggregated, anonymized data to chart the movements of people over time, by geography, but we made sure that that was happening at high-level categories in ways that protected people's privacy. And it showed those trends. It sort of delayed the trend, so it was showing at a 48 to 72-hour delay. And we think that the way that we did that was really kind of a critical way where we can engage with government around the types of data that we have and make it generally available to everyone. Those reports ended up being released across 131 countries and regions. And again, a powerful way to demonstrate how we can respect rights, protect those who are most vulnerable, and collaborate with key stakeholders to make a difference in the world. I also wanted to highlight some of the work that we have done and how this relates to data and digital diplomacy around artificial intelligence and innovation. Building off our longstanding support for the UN SDGs, we have done some really interesting projects to help sort of see the potential for AI for good and everywhere around the world in which we can make a difference using AI. So some examples of that are, we've applied Google AI research and engineering projects to have a positive social impact in things like stopping illegal fishing in Indonesia, forecasting floods in India, conserving native bird species in New Zealand. So these are all examples of ways in which we can use data to track key issues and work with stakeholders to surface that data in a way that helps us address key public policy issues. Lastly, I wanted to turn to a topic that I work on most of all, and that's about the open internet and human rights. The advent of the internet, obviously, a generation ago, fast-tracked human rights around the world in a way history has never seen. And Google's commitment to human rights, including the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights, dates back to our earliest years. Some of this work and sort of our work around and our commitment to human rights is especially important in the area of sort of when we look at content issues. In my work in particular, I advise the company on how we can preserve our deep commitment to free expression and access to information in a complicated global environment. So this means that we're thinking about how to be especially mindful of how these concepts can be the cornerstone for human rights defenders around the world. Broadly, platforms, the internet and platforms like YouTube have been a force for creativity and learning and access to information. But of course, at the same time, we recognize that they can be abused. And so we are dealing with these challenging, complex problems across our platforms. One example of that is hate speech. And so over the last few years, we've worked closely with partners to consult around the impacts of that type of harmful speech and have, based on those engagements, we've made several updates to our policies to remove more hateful content, reduce borderline content, and raise up authoritative voices on YouTube. I highlight this because our machine learning work has been especially impactful in significantly improving our ability to identify flagged content and help us swiftly remove that. And so that's another way in which data has helped us address key problems that all of the stakeholder groups, private sector, government, and civil society, as well as international organizations, are all working together, separately and together, to address. So I've walked through a handful of areas. I think there's a lot of discussion we could have across all of them. But I hope that they give us interesting fodder to discuss sort of how we can think about the work of private sector and supporting digital diplomacy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Alexandria Walden, for such a nice explanation. And of course, if I can conclude, you've mentioned that the development of Google Society, especially on how to use Google data to create a report to provide information for everyone during this pandemic. And also, you said that collaborating with stakeholders is important and is needed to protect the vulnerables and to protect the voiceless. So thank you very much, Ms. Walden, for becoming our last speaker. So by that, we are now entering the session of Q&A session. I have received several questions coming from our participants, but before that, I would like to give my own question to our speakers. I have a question for Mr. Ben Blunt, our second speaker. This is my own question, Mr. Blunt. If you would like to answer it, I would be very, very happy, because I highly believe and I also curious about the tips and tricks, even though I have watched your presentation and I also have heard your explanation about how to do the right research, but I would like to hear more, because there are possibilities for us getting trapped to the overwhelming flow of data. So how could we do our own research in a good and in a proper way so that we can get the data, and then after that we can visualize the data so that we can share it to the others? Mr. Ben Blunt.
Thanks, Cornelia. Well, I think the first thing I'd say is there is no easy way, right? It's often an iterative process, a lot of trial and error. It's very frustrating. I think when you're delving into big data sets, often you can spend a lot of time and not find anything useful. So one key is to know when to abandon a project. You might have spent, a day or a few days or weeks, some people maybe months in Excel spreadsheets, and sometimes you just have to step away and say, this isn't going where I want to go. So that's one tip. The other thing I'd say is to make sure you're asking big and clear questions at the beginning before you go on your search for the data. You got to have an idea about what kinds of questions you want to answer. And of course, along the way, you may find things that change the direction of your investigation. But I think if you set out at the beginning with a clear sense of what you want to discover, that will really help you be your guide. And then it'll also help you at the end. If you have those big questions, that helps you construct your narrative as well, because you know what the questions you're trying to answer. And that's an easy way to present whatever you've produced to the audiences you're trying to engage with. So in a brief way, those are some of the things that I think are helpful, but just get stuck in. That's the key. It's hard work, but I think it's fun when you can find trends and patterns that can communicate a story. And, we have all these amazing tools now to help us, and data from Google and many other platforms as well. So just try it.
Okay, so it's better to put our time and effort to do our own research and then find a pattern, and then we can narrow it down so that we can finally make and visualize our data. Thank you very much, Mr. Ben Blunt, for answering my questions. So we have several questions actually coming from our participants. I would read it from Mr. Satrio Santoso, an alumni from Ateneo de Davao, Philippines. The question is addressed to all the panelists. The question is, how do you see the trend of digital diplomacy in 2022, especially with the role of media in shaping states' image and the increasing of false news or hoax? I would give the time to Professor Jovan to answer it first. Professor, the time is yours.
Well, it's always interesting to speak about the future. Future is very tolerant. Whatever we say will be somehow corrected. But it's immediate future. Therefore, what we can see ahead is a more intensive use of definitely AI, development of hybrid meetings. Therefore, we miss being in Bali. I hope next time we'll join you in Bali. But this is the typical type of meeting. Some of you are in Bali at the conference center, and some of us join online. It will pose the new challenges because we know how to interact in situ. When we are physically together, there is a protocol, there are rules of procedure. We know how to do it online, more or less. We learned over the last year and a half. But the main challenge will be how to do it in hybrid way. Diplomacy will have to adjust, including protocol, including UN procedures, including voting, including all aspects of traditional diplomacy. This is the first trend. The second trend is that we will have more other actors joining diplomacy. But we just noticed that power of Apple is equal power of Vietnam. This is really to some extent shocking. you cannot discuss technological issue without having companies around the table. Therefore, the UN and the other places will have the involvement of civil society, local communities. And last point is that we need a genuine inclusion, not just fake inclusion. We have these days fake news, everything fake. There is also fake inclusion, which is nominal inclusion. We need inclusion of the real interests, cultural heritage, and cultural inputs from all places. And it's not just a question of fairness. It is a question of necessity. Without bringing rich heritage culture from Indonesia, from African countries, from Latin America, we won't develop sustainable and good governance solution for current moment and in particular for the future.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jovan, for answering the question. I will also give the time and floor to Pak Josua to answer this question. Pak Josua, how do you see the trend of digital diplomacy in 2022, especially with the role of media and the increasing number of false news or hoax, maybe we could say? Silakan, Pak Josua.
Right, it's a very interesting question. Well, probably it would be better to speak pragmatically. Since we live in the era where information can be spread around the world within minutes, where the hackers can hack government computer systems and disseminate the data therein to tell the truth about the government policies and interests, where confidential conversation can be accessed publicly somehow. So in that regard, probably the government should back to the basics, that is, do what the government say and say what the government do with all available social media. So because social media is like a shield and also a sword, it is required to protect the interest of the government, for example, to give information for public and to give services for the society. And on the other hand, it's also useful to respond in the sense of clarifying regarding, quote, the attack from many parts of entities or people against the government. So it means that since it is also a sword and also a shield, the government should be able to widely use social media platforms or digital events to promote or to educate and also to provide information regarding their policies.
I see. Thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak, Pak Josua, for answering our questions. Another question also coming from the same person, from Satrio Santoso. Another question is, in what way digital diplomacy can foster cooperation between states? I would like to have Mr. Ben Bland to answer this question. Mr. Bland, the time and floor is yours.
I think we've seen, as many speakers have said, digital tools used in the last couple of years, as we haven't been able to meet as much to connect. I think the challenge will be, as Jovan was hinting at, moving to this hybrid world. Hybrid meetings are actually really hard to organize. It's actually easier to be all online or all in person. So I think that's going to be one of the challenges moving forward. And the other one is something that Pat Josua just mentioned, which is trust in digital communication tools. That one of the reasons diplomats prefer in-person meetings is because there's not much trust in the confidentiality of our digital communication tools. It's so easy for them to be hacked by other states, by non-state actors. So I think those tools need to be improved quite a lot before they can be trusted ways for many different states to communicate with each other. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges of the coming year. Just briefly as well on this question of, fake news or hoaxes. We hear a lot about misinformation and disinformation. And a lot of governments call for Facebook and Google and Twitter constantly to remove these things. But in truth, I think rumor, conspiracy, that's been around for as long as humans have been around. And the best antidote isn't to remove things, it's actually to have more good quality information, clearer communications from governments, as Pat Josua was mentioning, but also more support for the media, for civil society, for independent, transparent, and timely information. We need to kind of wash out the bad with good information. I think that's really the best way forward, rather than fixating with the idea that we can kind of arrest people who spread fake news or force companies to delete it. That's never going to work. There's simply too many people on the internet. It's too democratized a space. So what we need is to support the pillars of quality information that we already have: media, civil society organizations, and kind of free debate in our politics and societies. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Blunt. Ms. Walden, I would like to give the time to you, since I would like Ms. Walden from Google to respond to what has been stated by Mr. Ben Blunt. Mr. Blunt stated earlier that it doesn't really need to remove the conspiracies and fake news on the internet, especially on Google. So do you have any different perspective about that? Especially if you work on Google, do you really think that we need to remove those things so the society could really find the data in a smooth way and don't really need to drown into the overwhelming of the data itself?
Thanks for that question. You know, I think Ben really touched on some of the key ways in which we think about this issue at Google. For us, we have a set of community guidelines or other product policies that set the rules of the road for what content is and is not permissible on the site. So on YouTube, on our other product policies, that does prohibit things like misleading or deceptive, some categories of misleading or deceptive content. And so that content that violates our policies is content that we remove. But Ben is exactly right. The volume of content means that we can remove as much as possible, but people will always be kind of pushing the edge. And so we need to have an approach for addressing this kind of category of content that goes beyond just removal. And so for us, we do remove content that violates our policies, but we also think about how we can raise up authoritative sources. And various other panelists spoke to this. How do we identify relevant and authoritative, credible sources and ensure that when people are looking for information, those are the sources they're finding first? And then relatedly, how do we reduce the visibility of content that might not be violative of our policies, but sort of cuts up against the border of where our policies are? So taken together, certainly there are things that we remove, but removal isn't the only part of the answer. We need a more comprehensive approach for how to manage these issues across all of our platforms.
Yeah, so what kind of approach that you think is going to be the best and sustainable way to tackle this problem, Ms. Walden?
I think that's it. I think, you know, maybe just to give a little more context, I think what I described is, I think, essentially the way companies should be approaching this, and they must do so in a way that is respectful of human rights and does the most to protect freedom of expression and access to information. At the same time, we need to work closely with our partners in civil society and in government to support media literacy initiatives to ensure that when anyone in the general public is looking for information on the internet, they understand how to read the context cues for the information that they're seeing. And so that's yet another way that companies and governments, civil society, educational institutions can work together to support a healthier online ecosystem.
Yeah, I see. So media literacy and responsibility of the audience, yeah, will be the essential key. So thank you very much, Ms. Walden. Thank you very much, our speakers, for such a fruitful discussion. This is what I call fruitful discussion for this Q&A. So I have another question coming from Supriyono from Unrika to the second speaker, to Mr. Ben Blunt. What is the potential of data in diplomatic practice? Mr. Blunt, please.
Well, thanks. I think I've mostly kind of set out my view on this, but obviously governments now can communicate directly to the public. You know, they no longer need to rely on the filter of media organizations. So I think there's a lot they can do to tell their stories, both to their own public, but also to other publics around the world. It's a kind of many-to-many diplomacy that we have now, not just governments to government. But I think there are risks there, right? That frankly speaking, a lot of foreign ministries aren't ready, in my opinion, for the kind of criticisms that they'll face, for the transparency that you need to show when you're going to be putting your data out there in the public domain. So I think it's a challenge, right? There's an opportunity there, but there are also a lot of risks if you manipulate the numbers, if you don't do things in a transparent way on the internet, on social media. People are going to find that out very quickly and call you out. So it risks undermining your credibility unless you can go about doing things in the right, open and transparent way. And I think all our governments talk about, leaning into freedom of information and open data. But truth be told, a lot of bureaucrats understandably are very nervous when it comes to actually being open about what they're doing. So I think we're not quite there yet. We need to need more confidence in our officials, in the ability to use data, but also they need support from the politicians that they're going to be allowed to be open and share, which, as I said, has risks as well as upsides.
Yeah, but how to minimize the risk and how to be more credible with our data? If we have done our research and the data is already visualized, then how we make ourselves more credible with the data that has been visualized so that our diplomatic practice is going to be more capable for ourselves?
Well, just briefly, as I said, show the working, right? It's like when you're studying maths at school, you got to show how you got the answers, and that's the key. Of course, not many people will download your methodology, but some people will. And just the fact that you're willing to show how you collated this, you're willing to show the data set, will give people confidence in what you're doing. So I think that's the key.
I see. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Blunt, for answering the questions. Now, another question coming from, I don't know, this one anonymous, but the question for the first speaker, for Pak Josua. Pak Josua, how can the government fully rely on data or consider data to drive its foreign policy or diplomacy, since data can be manipulated? Is there any standard or ways to distinguish real data with fraud data? Thank you. Pak Josua, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you. It's a tough question, and I'm not sure if there's any standard or way to distinguish real data or false data that could be accepted by many governments. But first of all, source of data plays an important role. So in this regard, it's difficult only to rely to one source of data. Ministry of ICT, for example, would require many data from many stakeholders in order to justify whether the data is valid or not. The second one, the sufficiency of reliable data, it is also important to determine the extent to which a policy should be based on. It is very dangerous, for example, if we put our policy based on, let's say, unfinished research or, for example, unclarified data. So verification of data also plays an important role in determining the reliability of data, and it makes sense. And usually after we collect data from various sources and also try to analyze and clarify the data, then the next part is we try to draft concepts of regulations and present the draft to our multi-stakeholders. And after we present to them, we should see their views, what are their views, and how they see the fitness between the policies and the data that we presented. It's just like, probably it's like a test water, but for example, a very crucial or very controversial policy, after we test the water and if the response from the stakeholders is positive, we could play with waves. It means that we elevate it to the next level to ask the response from, for example, foreign companies or foreign governments our neighbor states. And then last but not least, before we try to finalize or to decide the policy, then we should also cross-check with our diplomats from our neighboring states, discussing the issues and the data and the possible response that the neighboring governments would react with our draft of policy. I think that's some sort of an approach how to deal with the data. Thank you.
I see. Thank you very much, Pak Josua, for explaining to us on how our government rely to search to collect certain data to finally visualize it and narrow it down and share it to our society. Thank you very much, Pak Josua. So another question coming from University of Jember, Indonesia, from Sultan Effendi to Professor Jovan. Professor Jovan, the question is, how can we use common data to be more convincing and become strong data so that it can be used in diplomatic practice? Professor Jovan, the floor is yours.
First of all, we have to have a convincing message. There's I think, the underlying from today's discussion. Our message has to be convincing, but it's not enough. In order to convey the message, you obviously need the data to support what you're referring to. That's the first point. But you have to address different audiences. One is the public. I think we get the assumption that you communicate to public, but the other audience, which is equally or even more important for diplomats, especially traditional diplomacy, is the audience of a professional organization, UN. ASEAN in Jakarta. ASEAN has a headquarters. And you have to adjust your message to the language and the, let's say, cognitive framing of that group. What matters at that time in negotiation? How you're going to support what is interest of Indonesia, let's put in this way. Therefore, there are no possibilities to have one solution across the board. You use one solution for the general public, you use one solution for specific communities, and I'll give you just one illustration that MIT did research on, famous trolley concept, whom to save if there is option that you have to save the life of a mother with a child, very important businessman or elderly people. And findings were really, for some people, very shocking. Let's say Western society more inclined toward the mother with a child and the businessman, while Asian society put a lot of importance to elderly people. Therefore, you have to adjust to the medium where you're communicating. And this is one important mistake that we do when we use the internet. We think that internet is global technically, but it's not global culturally. You have to adjust to the specific needs of the Indonesia, Switzerland, Russia, United States. And you have, this is a cultural point, let's say national culture. And second point, you have to adjust to specificities of a professional culture. What matters for the negotiators today in New York? They're in a bubble. And if Indonesia wants to push for its resolution, for its project, for convention, it has to adjust to that professional culture. Therefore, three layers: general, public, global, national, cultural, and professional. Over.
I see. So you are actually saying that in order to use our data to be used in diplomatic practice, it needs to be collected at the very general idea first, and then we can narrow it down so that we can use it later on to our diplomatic practice, or how?
There are 2 points. Yes, you should have a general pool of well-tagged data. It's very important to have a well-tagged, and Ben mentioned how difficult it can be. It's not automatic. Second point, you start the learning journey, cognitive journey. You have the direction. I want to convince diplomats in New York that Indonesia proposal on the ABC is important. On that journey, you start discovering other meanders. Therefore, the connection between 2 dots in diplomacy is not straight line. Therefore, you start this journey And based on this big pool of data you have, or small data, like I mentioned, flags, you started connecting dots and navigating. You combine it with the listening to your interlocutors, what is important for them. Bottom line is, this boils down to good communication, common sense, empathy, and storytelling. Those characteristics or those talents are as old as humanity. When our far predecessor jumped from the tree somewhere in Serengeti in Africa and running away from lions, they started developing it. Sometimes we are a bit chrono-narcissistic. We think that everything is now today. It's big data, AI, but these things are as old as humanity. Therefore, a bit of common sense. You need infrastructure, you need a bit of technology, and well-tagged data, not necessarily a lot of data, but you can have a small amount of data, but well-tagged. And then diplomats, not data scientists. This is very important. Diplomats have to become data scientists. They start discovering patterns, and then they can understand how that patterns relate to their negotiation public diplomacy campaign. That would be, let's say, advice from my experience in dealing with this issue.
I see. I agree. You've mentioned that diplomats have to become data scientists because diplomats tend to do a lot of research before doing negotiation and before doing diplomatic practice. And you've mentioned earlier, not only connecting the dots, not only connecting the data that we already collected, but we also need to do another social humanity effort, such as storytelling or empathy and any other effort. So that's the answer from Professor Jovan. Thank you very much, Professor, for answering the question. It's a good answer, especially for our participants who are willing to be a diplomat like you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. So with that, we are at the end of our Q&A session. So ladies and gentlemen, with these 4 speakers in the panel and your responses, as well as the questions, indeed, the sessions has bring a new light to the term of big data and how it could contribute to digital diplomacy. If I could summarize a little bit from our speakers, I would say that there is a lot of things that we could get, especially about how we could implement the data, how we could really collect the data and then connect the data in order to create and to visualize the information, to share it to the others. And some of the speakers also have mentioned about the tips and tricks on how to do the research, how to put other efforts, other humanity efforts, such as empathy and any other effort. So I hope that this webinar, this discussion could really open your mind, especially about the importance of data, not only for digital diplomacy, but also for our life. Because as what our speakers mentioned earlier, digital diplomacy is also important with all the stuffs that have been explained by our 4 speakers. But the development of a lot of things, the development of facilities, the development of Google even, we really need to keep up with that so that we can really use the data, we could really use the information, and then we could really share it to the people the right way, the proper way to the society. So it is an honor for me to be able to moderate this session, and I really thank you, not only for the speakers, but for all the participants for joining with us today, for keeping up until the end of our Q&A session. I see you again. And of course, I wish you health, stay healthy, stay happy, and I'll see you again. Bye-bye.
Ciao, bye-bye.
Thank you. So thank you to our speakers, thank you to our moderator, and thank you for all the attendance. We will now end this meeting. Gentle reminder